The Vietnam War, also called the Second Indochina War, lasted from 1954 to 1975. This war was fought primarily between North Vietnamese Army and South Vietnam. South Vietnam was supported by the United States. The fight was primarily caused by the spread of communism into Southeast Asian nations. The war was long and bloody. The casualties of this war were very great for the Americans. The Vietnam War claimed the lives of over 58,000 American men. Unfortunately, 2 years after the United States withdrew from Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong were able to overrun South Vietnam and claim the victory. This war would become known as the only war America ever lost. The war spanned 4 presidencies, including Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Each president had their own strategy and would play a unique role in the war and America's involvement. Eisenhower's approach to the war in Vietnam was one that was against intervention. He wanted to stay out of the war while still helping to suppress the spread of communism. He was willing to support Vietnam in their fight for freedom, but did not think it was right to send American troops in. Eisenhower did state at one point that if 3 conditions were met, he would move to have America intervene. These conditions were the active participation of countries such as Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines, a full political understanding with France, likely meaning independence for the Associated States of Indochina, and French participation in the rest of the war, and advanced congressional approval. The goal of the United States seemed to be to preserve the freedom of the Southeast Asian states by protecting them from the spread of communism. So Eisenhower shifted his focus to strengthening South Vietnam. Between 1954 and 1961, Eisenhower worked closely with Nguyen Thanh Diem, Prime Minister of Vietnam, to establish a nation-building program to transform South Vietnam into a viable independent state. Eisenhower also worked with countries from all around the world to create a program that would support freedom by building up democratic countries and stopping the spread of communism. The SEATO Alliance was formed in September of 1945. This alliance was made up of the United States, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan. Although its name is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, there were only 2 Southeast Asian countries involved, Thailand and the Philippines. The purpose of this alliance was to protect Southeast Asia from the spread of communism. It also helped to boost the economy and living standards of the Southeast Asian states. When Kennedy came to office in 1961, he inherited the burden of the Vietnam War. It was now up to him whether or not the United States would become involved in the war or continue to offer their support from afar. The war had begun to worsen as Viet Cong guerrillas from the north were beginning to weaken the government of South Vietnam. Religious differences in South Vietnam were also responsible for riots which debilitated further Nguyen Thanh Diem's government. As part of his nation-building plan for South Vietnam, Eisenhower had sent around 700 military advisors to South Vietnam. Kennedy raised the amount of American financial aid and increased the number of U.S. military advisors to about 16,000. He also encouraged Diem to repair his government and weed out some of the corruption. Unfortunately, in November of 1963, both Diem and Kennedy were assassinated. In September of 1963, 2 months before his death, Kennedy announced his position and approach to the war in Vietnam. Kennedy declared in an interview, "In the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it. The people of Vietnam against the communists." But I don't agree with those who would say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake. The United States made this effort to defend Europe. Now Europe is quite secure. We also have to participate, we may not like it, in the defense of Asia. However, with the death of Diem and the overthrow of the South Vietnamese government, Kennedy continued to struggle to decide whether to send American troops into Vietnam or withdraw from the war altogether. Historians today still debate about which course they believe he would have taken. Because of Kennedy's untimely death, President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn into office in November of 1963. He immediately formed a task force led by William P. Bundy to try to decide what should be done in Vietnam. This group came up with several strategies and plans, and after reviewing them, Johnson chose the strategy of graduate response. The plan envisioned a series of measures of gradually increasing military intensity that American forces would apply to bolster morale in Saigon, attack the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, and pressure Hanoi into ending its aid of the communist insurgency. Some of Johnson's key advisors over the next couple years included Secretary of Defense McNamara, Secretary of State Rusk, and Commander William Westmoreland. In August 1964, the United States was involved in an incident that would change the course of the war. 2 U.S. ships stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam were fired upon by North Vietnamese forces. Johnson took this information to Congress and requested that the Congress approve United States military involvement in Vietnam. Congress deliberated and passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7, 1964. This resolution gave President Johnson permission to do whatever he deemed necessary to protect Southeast Asia from communism and bring peace. Johnson implemented operation after operation. Many of the operations involved bombing of North Korean territory, base camps, and supply lines. The war was very costly for the United States, both in number of lives lost and the amount of money spent. During Johnson's time in office, there were many Americans who joined what was known as the anti-war movement. Americans would protest the war and demand that the president bring peace. Many young men even refused to be drafted and participate in the war. The dissension within the country would last all the way through Nixon's presidency. In a meeting near the end of his presidency, Johnson is recalled to have said, "I know we oughtn't to be there, but I can't get out. I just can't be the architect of surrender." Johnson did not run for presidency again in 1968. Instead, he allowed the burden of the Vietnam War to be passed on to a new president. When Nixon came to office in 1968, America was still very disillusioned with the war in Vietnam. They were ready for a president who would put an end to America's involvement. Nixon was hopeful that he would be able to quickly do this for America. However, it took almost 5 more years. In order to at least reduce the number of American casualties, Nixon began to implement a strategy that he called Vietnamization. Within this strategy, the Americans would train and supply the best weapons to South Vietnamese armies so that they could handle more of the fighting on their land. The lottery as a form of enlisting men was also implemented in place of the draft. Nixon used bombing, part of Operation Linebacker, as a way to scare the North Vietnamese into seeking peace. Nixon went as far as to bomb North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia. This led to the weakening of the Cambodian government and its fall to communist regime. After years of continued bombing and war, a ceasefire was signed in January of 1973 between the United States, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. Americans would finally end their involvement in the Vietnam War and completely withdraw by March of that year.